Yes, Ms. Richards.
Good morning, sir. Today is about looking at various pieces of guidance issued by a range of organisations. The purpose of today is in some respects intended as a companion piece to the expert evidence we heard from the medical ethics group. So whilst the ethics group explored extremely eloquently and usefully the ethical principles, key ethical principles that may guide clinical decision-making and clinical conduct, what we didn't ask the ethics group to do, and what they would not have been in a position to do, was to conduct a historical investigation into what, as a matter of fact, was issued by way of ethical guidance to clinicians or other healthcare professionals in earlier decades. That's work the inquiry has undertaken and has near completed, albeit there is still some further work to undertake. Some visits, for example, to archives held by some of the Royal Colleges, which was held up because of the events of the last year or so. But so today I'll be looking at what, as a matter of fact, was being said in guidance by clinical organisations, in particular in the 70s, 80s and early 90s. There are two pieces of material that the inquiry has produced that effectively accompany this. There's a chronology, which I'm not proposing to go to today, but which has been disclosed to core participants. And then there's a written note, which again has been disclosed to core participants, but hopefully will also get placed after today on the inquiry website, so that those who are not core participants can have the opportunity of reading the material. What I'm not going to be looking at is case law. The chronology does identify some of the significant cases on issues such as consent in the context of clinical negligence over the years. But clearly, so you're precluded from making findings about civil or criminal liability. And in any event, as the expert group made clear, ethical principles, the question of what doctors should do, go far wider than the minimum requirements that might exist in order to avoid a successful claim in negligence. So the focus of today is not about cases, it's about what the GMC or the BMA or other organisations have said to doctors over the years as to how they should conduct themselves in areas of decision-making or action that's relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference. So the four themes that I'll be looking at in the course of today are guidance relevant to issues about consent and informed consent, guidance relevant to issues about the confidentiality of medical information, guidance relevant to the conduct of research in an ethically appropriate manner, and then fourthly, guidance from the 80s and early 90s relating to particular ethical issues that arose in the context of the AIDS crisis. What I'm going to do, however, first of all, is just set out some of the key organisations who have issued guidance. I'm not going to describe all of them that we've set out in the note, but provide a little bit of information about the principal organisations so that we can understand the status and of the guidance and who might have seen it, or indeed the limitations of the guidance. And part of today's exercise may be to assist you in seeing what wasn't being said to doctors and perhaps could or should have been. So with that introduction, the first key organisation from whom some guidance has emanated over the years is the General Medical Council. The General Medical Council is the professional regulator for doctors. It has other significant roles and responsibilities too, particularly in relation to medical education. But for present purposes, its guidance largely emanates from its role as the regulator of doctors. The General Medical Council, in some form or another, has existed since the middle of the 19th century, and its powers have changed over the years as legislation, primary legislation governing its role and responsibilities has been amended. If we just have a quick look at the witness statement of Mr. Massey, Shomik, it's WITN 3365001. Mr. Massey is the current Chief Executive and Registrar of the General Medical Council, And he's provided the inquiry with a statement which provides some historical background and context in terms of the regulation of doctors. If we go to the second page, please, Shomik, and we pick it up in paragraph 5, Mr. Massey refers to the decades in which the events that the inquiry is investigating took place, and says that period has seen a number of fundamental changes to medical regulation. And then if we go to paragraph 6, please, we will see that he says that the period from the 1970s to the early 2000s saw a model of medical self-regulation which was dominated by the medical profession. In other words, doctors regulated doctors. A broadly equivalent model existed in the other regulated health professions. The GMC's governing body, the Council, was made up largely of doctors elected by their peers, with a minority of lay members appointed by the Privy Council to represent the public interest. And then he explains how that has, in this century, changed in paragraph 7 of his statement. And in paragraph 8 says, this shift in the composition of the Council is reflective of the move away from the late 20th century model of self-regulation to one of greater partnership between the profession and the public. And then if we go to the next page, he refers to some of the documents the GMC has issued over the years, and we'll look at some of those in a moment. But under the heading Development of the Fitness to Practice process, there's then a useful summary there of the way in which that has changed over the years. So he says in paragraph 14, in the 70s, continuing up until 1980, the GMC's fitness to practice remit extended only to issues of criminal conviction and conduct. And I should say that fitness to practice means the GMC exercising powers to discipline doctors, essentially. And then he talks about how that was modified to bring in performance procedures so that the way in which doctors were discharging their clinical responsibilities in more general terms could also be looked at. You'll note, sir, in paragraph 16, he says, prior to 2002, making a complaint to the GMC had been a complex procedure for complainants, involving sworn affidavits, very little support or explanation of our processes. This put off many patients making complaints to the GMC, and thus the bulk of our referrals came from employers and other doctors at the time. And then he contrasts that with what he says the current position is today. We aim to provide much greater support for those who wish to make a complaint. And then if we go over, Shomik, to page 5, please. We just pick it up in paragraph 27. He explains that the General Medical Council's procedures for developing and agreeing standards of good practice for doctors were established after 1980, when the GMC was given the legal power to give advice to the medical profession on standards of conduct and performance and medical ethics. Before the 1980s, the GMC did not set professional standards, although it did set out a number of general principles arising from the disciplinary cases published in its annual Blue Book, and we'll look at some examples of that in a moment. And then he explains in paragraph 29 that with this new power to give advice from 1980, the GMC set up a standards and ethics committee with responsibility for considering questions about standards of good practice and making recommendations and so on. So that's just a quick overview of some of the ways in which the GMC's role, or the way in which it performs its role, has, according to Mr. Massey, changed over the decades, with a different approach now to how the approach might have been in the decades with which the inquiry is particularly concerned. If we then have a look at some of the material in which the GMC, in terms of its general guidance to doctors, issued in those periods, from 1963 onwards, so we can take down the statement, thank you, Shomik. From 1963 onwards, the GMC did issue booklets to doctors. The booklets were called Functions, Procedure and Disciplinary Jurisdiction, And the first was, we think, published in 1963, and then there were updated booklets published in a number of years that followed. We'll see when we look at an example of it, it gave very limited advice. We're no doubt all familiar nowadays with the term professional misconduct in relation to professions such as doctors or indeed other health professions, lawyers. The term that was in play in the 60s and 70s in the medical world was infamous conduct in a professional respect. And the booklets that we'll look at some examples of essentially did little more by way of guidance to doctors than give some examples of what might amount to infamous conduct in a professional respect. So if we look at an example of one of these booklets, can we go to GMCO 301697? We can see this is the first one that we've identified from 1963, Functions, Procedure and Disciplinary Jurisdiction. If we go to the third page, we'll see what it is under the heading Introduction. This account of the Council's functions, procedure and disciplinary jurisdiction is intended primarily for the information of doctors who've recently qualified in the British Isles. And then we'll see if we go down the page, it has a section on medical education, which is talking about the training that doctors go through. If we go over the page, it has a section on the medical register and the requirement for doctors to be registered. And then if we go on 2 pages, we can see we get to a heading, Disciplinary Jurisdiction and Procedure. So this is the closest we get as at this point in time to any kind of guidance to doctors generally on how they should conduct themselves. You'll see in bold print it said the Council fully realises and appreciates the high standard of professional conduct of the vast majority of doctors in this country who will never find themselves directly concerned with the Council's disciplinary jurisdiction. And then if we go down the page a little further, just above the heading in italics, if we pick up the heading in italics, the Council's approach to infamous conduct and its duty to protect the public. And we see there the phrase infamous conduct in a professional respect. So that was the standard by which doctors were judged at this point in time by the General Medical Council. And then what this guidance does really is just give some types of example of infamous conduct in a professional respect. So if we go to the next page, bottom of the page, the first example that's given is convictions, so criminal convictions. And then if we go over the page, picking it up about 6 lines down, it says, in the light of the Council's experience over the last 100 years, it's possible to indicate with examples a number of types of offence or misconduct which raise disciplinary issues. So these are, as it makes clear, intended only to be examples, but they're very limited examples in reality. So we have, by way of examples, illegal abortion, improperly purveying dangerous drugs, adultery with a patient. And then you will see a reference there to improperly disclosing information obtained in confidence from a patient. So when I come to the theme of guidance on issues of confidentiality, we'll look and see in more detail at what was said over the years about that. But that is something that's been identified as a key issue, the requirements of confidentiality from an early stage. And then gross neglect in diagnosis or treatment, covering medical practice by unregistered persons, and then convictions arising out of abuse of alcohol or addiction to drugs are the examples given. And if we just go 2 pages on, you'll see a bottom of the page, again, very limited information about disregard of personal responsibilities to patients or gross neglect. It simply says, in pursuance of its primary duty to protect the public, the Council may feel bound to take cognizance of a case, whether or not it's been investigated under the National Health Service machinery, in which a doctor may appear to have seriously disregarded his personal responsibilities to his patients or to have been guilty of gross neglect of his professional duties. And then we get onto issues such as abuse of alcohol, abuse of drugs, and so on. the longest section, if we go on to page 13, Shomek, I think the longest individual section in this guidance and in its subsequent iterations for a number of years was actually about advertising and criticising other doctors, or essentially. And I think I'm right in recalling correctly from the evidence of the expert group. You may recall the use of the term etiquette. Quite a lot of the early guidance was really about what could be described as matters of etiquette, how a doctor should describe their practice or how a doctor should or shouldn't interact with other doctors, rather than the patient-focused emphasis that we will, as we'll see, then begins to emerge over the years. So that's the fairly limited nature of the guidance issued in this booklet by the GMC in 1963. We won't go to all the various iterations. It doesn't change very significantly, but we will perhaps just pick it up with the 1970 version, which is GMC 0301696. Please, Shomek. Oh, that's 1971, sorry. Let's pick it up in 1970. Sorry, Shomek, 1696_019. My apologies. There we are. This is really to show how little anything changed in terms of the contents of the booklet. If we go to the second page, again, we'll see it follows the same basic structure. If we turn to page 7, we pick it up under the second paragraph beginning under the Act. There's reference to the duty to the public, and if we pick it up 5 lines down, subject, however, to their overriding duty to the public, members of the committee may and do constantly ask themselves, what is in the best interest of the doctor himself? And that wouldn't, I think, be the modern approach to regulation, whether by this regulator or any other, but that's the approaches at 1970. And then at the beginning of the next paragraph, the counsel is as concerned as the doctors themselves to avert, wherever possible, any need for a formal disciplinary inquiry into a doctor's conduct. Again, may give some indication as to the approach to regulation of the profession in 1970 to see those words. And then if we go over the page, we can see that the examples given of infamous conduct are similar to what we saw from 1963. So again, it's abortion, drugs, adultery, confidentiality or breach of confidentiality remains in there. We have added at the bottom offences discreditable to the doctor and his profession, false pretences, forgery, fraud, theft, indecent behaviour, assault and so on. And then if we go to the top of the next page, we can see a couple more examples: improper attempts to profit at the expense of professional colleagues, and then abuse of financial opportunities afforded by medical practice. But again, there's little that is patient-focused or that captures the kind of ethical principles and norms that the expert group told us about in the course of their evidence. From 1971, the booklet that was produced by the GMC changed slightly, and so we'll look at that. It's GMC 0301696_002. So it was still a booklet issued to doctors. It was now called simply Professional Discipline and was commonly referred to as the Blue Book. If we go to the third page, we will see from, under the heading Statutory Provisions, the last sentence of that section, the subparagraph 2, we'll see there the term serious professional misconduct appears. So infamous conduct in a professional respect has been replaced as a concept by serious professional misconduct. And if we go over the page, we see the heading meaning of serious professional misconduct, and then there's an explanation that the legislation has substituted the phrase, that phrase for the phrase infamous conduct in a professional respect. If we then go on to page 9, we can see this again essentially gives examples of the types of conduct that might result in a doctor at this point in time being called before the disciplinary committee of the General Medical Council. So again, it's not advice to doctors on the principles or by which they should regulate their conduct or their interactions with patients. It's this conduct might result in a finding of a serious professional misconduct. And we can see bottom of that page, it says, this part of the pamphlet sets out certain kinds of offences and of professional misconduct which have in the past led to disciplinary proceedings by the council. And then if we go over the page, we do now get, as the first item, disregard of personal responsibilities to patients, although it appears that what's envisaged there is a failure to treat. Again, there's no real content to try to illuminate what's meant by this, other than the examples of a failure to visit or to provide treatment for a patient. But that is now the first example given, and then we get some of the familiar examples: abuse of alcohol. We go over the page. Abuse of dangerous or scheduled drugs, termination of pregnancy, abuse of professional position to further an improper association or adultery. We do then see abuse of professional confidence, and again I'll come back to the issue of confidentiality at a later stage, and then offences involving dishonesty, indecency or violence. Over the page, you'll again see the longest section of this document is devoted to advertising and the principles governing relationships between doctors, rather than the principles governing relationships between doctors and patients. If we go to the last page, just draw attention to the... oh, no, that's not the last page of what I have. Sorry, Shomik, if we go to page 15... Let me just go back, Shomik, I don't think this is the right document now. GMCO 301696_002. You seem to have 020 instead. That's it, thank you. So we can see under the heading conclusion, it must be emphasised that the categories of misconduct described above cannot be regarded as exhaustive, since from time to time with changing circumstances, the Council's attention is drawn to new forms of professional misconduct, any abuse by a doctor of any of the privileges and opportunities afforded to him, or any grave dereliction of professional duty or serious breach of medical ethics. So we get that concept, at least, of medical ethics introduced here, may give rise to a charge of serious professional misconduct. But there is still a dearth of guidance from the GMC in these booklets, or these blue books, as to what might amount to a breach of medical ethics.
So thus far, it was telling you what not to do rather than what to do.
Yes.
And the sting was in the enforcement, in that if you did something you ought not to do, and it was proved to what was then the relevant standard, you could have your registration removed.
Yes.
And that didn't mean you ceased to be a doctor. It simply meant that you couldn't practice in the NHS, or you wouldn't get an appointment.
I'd have to check, sir. I'm very familiar with what the current sanctions that the GMC can impose are, but what the range of sanctions as at 1970 or in the 1970s, I'd have to check. Currently, the General Medical Council has a range of sanctions which would include, as its most serious sanction, the sanction of erasure or striking someone off the medical register, which means they cannot practice as a doctor, whether in the NHS or privately. And then there are lesser but still serious sanctions, including suspension.
I think in the documents you've already shown us, they had that system was operating from early times, erasure, the most serious penalty, obviously, suspension. I think this document, it may be the one before, refers to suspension for no more than 12 months.
Yes, and then there has been for a number of years powers to impose conditions on a doctor's registration, but when that began, I can't off the top of my head tell you. But you're absolutely right, sir. That was the approach. This was telling you what not to do, and you ran the risk if you did something you shouldn't do, you could be struck off or disciplined by the General Medical Council.
So it would have a normative effect in doctors being very careful not to do what they shouldn't, and therefore behaving in a particular, at least in a particular minimum way. Yes,
yes. And then if we go to, if we really then move forward to 1985, so you'll recall from Mr. Massey's statement, he said that it was in 1980 the GMC was given certain powers to issue advice. And that changed in the Medical Act 1978, which led to the establishment by the GMC of what was then called its Standard and Ethics Committee. If we then really have to look at the 1985 Blue Book to start getting a little more articulation of some general principles, although it's still relatively limited. So if we go to GMCO 0001696_011, please, Shomik. So this is the Blue Book from April 1985. We go to the second page. You'll see under the foreword it says, this edition of the Council's Blue Pamphlet includes new guidance to the profession, which was approved by the Council in May and November 84 and in February 85. In Part 2, under the heading Responsibility for Standards of Medical Care on page 10, the Council has defined the features of the standard of medical care which the public are entitled to expect from a registered medical practitioner. And then it refers to various other aspects, including further guidance on professional confidence, so the issue of confidentiality, and on financial relationships between doctors and other organisations. But if we go to what was really a new feature of this Blue Book, it should be electronic page 15, I think, Shomik. Yes, so it's internal page 10. Neglect or disregard of personal responsibilities to patients for their care and treatment. And then here we have some positive advice to doctors on what they should do. So under the heading Responsibility for Standards of Care, it says, in pursuance of its primary duty to protect the public, the Council may institute disciplinary proceedings when a doctor appears seriously to have disregarded or neglected his professional duties. And then we see the same examples as given in earlier versions of the booklet. Failure to visit or to provide or arrange treatment for a patient when necessary. And then if we pick it up in the next paragraph, the public are entitled to expect that a registered medical practitioner will afford and maintain a good standard of medical care. This includes conscientious assessment of the history, symptoms and signs of a patient's condition, sufficiently thorough professional attention, examination and, where necessary, diagnostic investigation, competent and considerate professional management, appropriate and prompt action upon evidence suggesting the existence of a condition requiring urgent medical intervention, and readiness, where the circumstances so warrant, to consult appropriate professional colleagues. And then if we pick it up then in the paragraph beginning, the Council is concerned. The Council is concerned with errors in diagnosis or treatment and with the kind of matters which give rise to action in the civil courts for negligence only when the doctor's conduct in the case has involved such a disregard of his professional responsibility to patients or such a neglect of his professional duties as to raise a question of serious professional misconduct. A question of serious professional misconduct may also arise from a complaint or information about the conduct of a doctor which suggests that he's endangered the welfare of patients by persisting in unsupervised practice of a branch of medicine in which he doesn't have the appropriate knowledge and skill and has not acquired the experience which is necessary. So we have some positive advice, and then again this is what you should not do. They're set out, and that was, as the foreword made clear, new in terms of the booklets, the blue books issued by the General Medical Council. Now this guidance was updated over the years that followed. I'm not going to go to all the subsequent versions. Some develop things in a little more detail than others, but it broadly follows a similar format to the 1985 Blue Book. It wasn't until the early 90s that the GMC Standards Committee started to try and create a description, a positive description of what a doctor should do and how a doctor should conduct themselves, the essential attributes of a good doctor. And what that resulted in is finally the publication of something called Good Medical Practice. That's, or the first version of that we can see at RCGP 0000-533_005. This is the 1995 publication, which was the first publication of Good Medical Practice. If we go to the next page, please, Shomik. And again, if you can zoom in on the top, because it's impossible to read otherwise. So we can see there set out on the left-hand side the duties of a doctor registered with the General Medical Council. Patients must be able to trust doctors with their lives and well-being. To justify that trust, we as a profession have a duty to maintain a good standard of practice and care and to show respect for human life. In particular, as a doctor, you must make the care of your patient your first concern. Treat every patient politely and considerately. Respect patients' dignity and privacy. Listen to patients and respect their views. Give patients information in a way they can understand. Respect the rights of patients to be fully involved in decisions about their care. Keep your professional knowledge and skills up to date. Recognise the limits of your professional competence. Be honest and trustworthy. Respect and protect confidential information. Make sure that your personal beliefs do not prejudice your patient's care. Act quickly to protect patients from risk if you have good reason to believe that you or a colleague may not be fit to practice. Avoid abusing your position as a doctor and work with colleagues in ways that best serve patients' interests. And many of those bullet points will resonate in terms of their relevance to much of the evidence that you've heard, both from those who were patients and from clinicians. And then we can see on the right-hand side, guidance to doctors. Being registered with the General Medical Council gives you rights and privileges. In return, you must meet the standards of competence, care and conduct set by the GMC. This booklet sets out the basic principles of good practice. It is guidance, it's not a set of rules, nor is it exhaustive. The GMC publishes more detailed guidance on confidentiality, advertising and the ethical problems surrounding HIV and AIDS, and we'll look at the latter at a later stage. Now, it's right to say that although this was new guidance, these were not, or it may ultimately be a matter for your judgment, sir, but if we think about the evidence from the expert group, these are not new principles, but they're being articulated here by the GMC for the first time in a publication to doctors. And if we just go to the next page, zoom in, we can see then some of the bullet points that we saw listed on that first page are then explored in greater detail. So under the heading Good Clinical Care, paragraph 2, talks about the importance of an adequate assessment of the patient's condition, providing or arranging investigations or treatment where necessary, referring the patient to another practitioner. We look at the bottom of that paragraph 3. In providing care, you must keep clear, accurate and contemporaneous patient records which report the relevant clinical findings, the decisions made, information given to patients and any drugs or other treatment prescribed. we go to the right-hand column, so third bullet point, prescribe only the treatment drugs or appliances that serve patients' needs. And then we see the importance of keeping up to date, if we can just look at that. So you must maintain the standard of your performance by keeping your knowledge and skills up to date throughout your working life. You should take part regularly in educational activities which relate to your branch of medicine. And then if we go to the next page, please, Shomek. Again, if we can zoom in. So under the heading, Maintaining Trust, professional relationships with patients. So again, patients really start to become to the forefront in this guidance in a way in which they weren't in the previous booklets. Successful relationships between doctors and patients depend on trust. To establish and maintain that trust, you must listen to patients and respect their views. Treat patients politely and considerately. Respect patients' privacy and dignity. Give patients the information they ask for or need about their condition, its treatment and prognosis. Give information to patients in a way they can understand. Respect the right of patients to be fully involved in decisions about their care. Respect the rights of patients to refuse treatment or take part in teaching or research. And then, top of the next page, respect the right of patients to a second opinion. Ask patients' permission, if possible, before sharing information with their spouses, partners, or relatives. And if we go to the bottom of that page, paragraph 15, again, the importance of trust. Because the doctor-patient relationship is based on trust, you have a special responsibility to make the relationship with your patients work. And then if we go to the next page, you'll see there's a section on confidentiality. Paragraph 16, right to respect will not pass on any personal information which you learn in the course of your professional duties. Again, I'll explore that in more detail later. And then the next section, abuse of your professional position. You must not abuse your patient's trust. You must not, for example, and if we look at the third, fourth and fifth bullet points, improperly disclose or misuse confidential information about patients, recommend or subject patients to investigation or treatment which you know is not in their best interests, deliberately withhold appropriate investigation, treatment or referral. And then if we go to page 8, please, Shomek. Zoom in. On the right-hand side, you'll see there the heading research. Again, I'll be exploring the guidance in relation to research in more detail, but so as to avoid the need to come back to this document, you'll see it says under the heading research, 43, if you're taking part in clinical trials of drugs or other research involving patients, you must make sure that research is not contrary to the patient's interests. Check that the research protocol has been approved by a properly constituted research ethics committee. You must keep to all aspects of the research protocol, may accept only those payments approved by a research ethics committee. Your conduct in the research must not be influenced by payment or gifts. You must always record your research results truthfully and maintain adequate records. And then paragraph 46, you should read the guidance on confidentiality in research. So that's good medical practice, the first version of which was produced in 1995. And a form of good medical practice has since then formed the bedrock of the GMC's guidance to doctors. It's changed over the years, it's been expanded, but it remains at the heart of the advice that the GMC now promulgates to doctors.
Just one question which arises out of it. The word, and it may just be reading too much into one word, but the obligation is to keep medical records. The word used is keep, not make. The guidance envisages the handing over of records if the doctor and patient lose trust in each other and the patient moves on to another doctor. And the word used here in research is maintain adequate records. Is there any guidance at all as to for how long and in what circumstances they are to be kept?
Not in the materials we're looking at today. There are other materials relating to practices in terms of medical records, guidance that's been issued over the years, different practices in different local areas, impacts of data protection legislation and so on. We'll be exploring those, I think, it's probably at a rather later stage of the inquiry's hearings, when we look at issues about candour, transparency, cover-up.
It may be that the doctor most in mind of those who drafted this would have been the general practitioner who, if he were a sole practitioner or she were a sole practitioner, might be expected to go on seeing the same patient over and over again, which is not necessarily the model today.
That's quite possibly the case.
And it wouldn't necessarily apply in the same way to hospitals, where the keeping of records is tends to be a shared responsibility.
Yes, and it is obviously an important matter that we will be looking into further. But there's no further guidance in this material in relation to records. Mr. Massey's witness statement tells us that the publication of this document was regarded as a fundamental shift by the GMC in its approach to meeting its regulatory responsibilities, and we can see why when we look at it and compare it to the earlier versions of the booklet. That's some of the general material emanating from the GMC. The next body, which was a prolific source of information in the decades with which we are in particular concerned, was the British Medical Association, the BMA. Now, the BMA is not a regulatory body, so it doesn't have the same function as the General Medical Council. It's a professional association and trade union for doctors. Like the GMC, it was founded in the 19th century, in 1832. The BMA has had an ethics committee in some form or another since the middle of the 19th century, first established, I think, in 1849. And it's produced over the years guidance notes and had a role in providing advice to individual doctors. But it's also a source of important publications over the years. If we go to, a moment when I get the reference, the GMC's publication, sorry, the BMA's publication from 1949 on ethics. It is RCPH 40226. So we see it's entitled Ethics and Members of the Medical Profession. We can see from the bottom of the page it's published by the BMA in 1949. We go to the third page. We can see the preface. A high standard of ethics is expected from members of the medical profession. This standard has on occasion proved difficult to maintain in recent years on account of the upheaval caused by the war. This booklet has been prepared by the British Medical Association primarily for the information of practitioners who've qualified during the last 10 years, and an attempt has been made in the following pages to set out in a form easy for reference the salient points of medical ethics. It is hoped that practitioners will find guidance on the numerous problems relating to professional conduct with which they're likely to be confronted. And then if we go over the page, you can see there's some very general observations under the heading Ethics and Members of the Medical Profession. The medical profession occupies a position of privilege in society because of the understanding that a doctor's calling is to serve humanity under all conditions, and because in the past members of the profession have built up a tradition of placing the needs of the patient before all else. On admission to the Brotherhood of Medicine, every new member not only succeeds to the benefit of its special place in society, but also takes upon himself the duty of maintaining this high position. The justification for the freedom of medicine lies in the hands of those who practice it. And then reference is made to the Hippocratic Oath. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, it says, today these general rules still hold good as part of a code of standards of professional behaviour, which must be observed if the honour and dignity of the profession are to endure. To command the respect of his patients and the public should be the aim of every doctor. The strict observance of basic ethical principles will enable the doctor to attain this end, which is necessary to good practice and to successful treatment. There's then a section on the General Medical Council. If we go on to page 9, we see the heading Code of Professional Conduct, and the guidance says this: in addition to the requirements of the General Medical Council and in elaboration of them, there are customs and ethical rules which are observed by the profession as a code of conduct. The endless number of situations that might and do arise in the course of professional life cannot all be covered specifically in any set of rules. The following rulings are accepted as covering the major and more common features of professional life and will serve to illustrate the principles of behaviour. These principles can be and should be applied to other problems and situations that may arise. And then it says, when in doubt, a practitioner's would be wise to seek advice from one of the professional organisations or from a colleague of experience. Now, those sound as though what's going to follow is then a detailed articulation of what doctors should do. In fact, it's perhaps more notable for what isn't in the guidance. So if we go to the next page, and I'll just pick it up on the headings that are in bold print. So the first section is about setting up in practice and how it's regarded as unethical to set up in practice in an area where you've already been in partnership and it's broken down. So it's about respecting the right of your fellow doctors to practice in a particular geographical area. Next bold topic is premises and door plate. We go to the next page. Relationship with other practitioners. We go over the page. Relationship with dentists. We go to the next page. Association with clergy. Following page, association with chemists and opticians, commercial enterprises and patenting, and bottom of the page, insurance agents. Next page, lectures, broadcasting and television, publications. Go towards the bottom of that page. Change of address or conditions of practice. Over the page, telephone directories. Then we get to something which is patient-focused, only at the bottom of this page, professional secrecy. And so that here introduces confidentiality into this document. So a practitioner should not disclose voluntarily without the consent of the patient, preferably written information which he's obtained in the course of his professional relationship with the patient. And then the rest of that page is concerned with circumstances in which confidential information might be disclosed. And then over the page, termination of pregnancy, nursing homes and dichotomy, the headings there. So in terms of the issues with which we're concerned and the kind of ethical principles which our expert group articulated to us, this document doesn't really address any of those matters with the exception of the section on confidentiality. So perhaps more significant for what it doesn't cover than for what it does. We really need to go to 1970, so to move on from 1949 to 1970 to see the first substantive publication on what the kind of areas that we might have expected to see covered in the BMA's medical ethics document, which we'll find at BMAL 5085. So you'll see, so again, this is published by the British Medical Association. It's entitled Medical Ethics, and we see the date in the bottom right-hand corner, 1970. We go over to the third page, please, Shomik. Medical ethics. You'll note, sir, or at least I noted on reading this, the masculine pronoun used throughout to denote a doctor, but in any event, the brotherhood of medicine. The entrant to the profession of medicine joins a fraternity dedicated to the service of humanity. He will be expected to subordinate his personal interests to the welfare of his patients, and together with his brother practitioners to seek to raise the standard of health in the community among which he practices. He inherits traditions of professional behaviour on which he must base his own conduct and which he must pass on untarnished to his successors. And then we see reference to the Hippocratic Oath. And then we see this: while the methods and details of medical practice change with the passage of time and the advance of knowledge, the fundamental principles of professional behaviour have remained unaltered through the recorded history of medicine. From time to time, attempts have been made to codify the standard of conduct expected of the doctor in the practice of his profession, the most celebrated being that attributed to Hippocrates in the 5th century BC. And then you'll see there set out an English translation of the Hippocratic Oath. And then if we go over the page, we can then see, and we'll look at some of these materials in more detail in a little while, but we'll see there concepts of ethical principles are here articulated in contrast to the 1949 document. And we see reference to an international code of medical ethics and to the Declaration of Geneva. I'm going to come back to that. And we looked at some of this material with the expert group in their evidence earlier this year. But we can see that the Declaration of Geneva intended to constitute some form of international code of medical ethics. In fact, actually, whilst we're here, we might as well look at it. We can see the text there. At the time of being admitted as a member of the medical profession, I solemnly pledge myself to consecrate my life to the service of humanity. It's the first promise. The third is I will practice my profession with conscience and dignity. And then this: the health of my patient will be my first consideration. And then I will respect the secrets which are confided to me. So that's the Declaration of Geneva. And then bottom of the page, we see the English text of the International Code of Medical Ethics. Duties of doctors in general: a doctor must always maintain the highest standards of professional conduct. And then if we go to the next page, I'll just pick up on the right-hand column. A doctor owes to his patient complete loyalty and all the resources of his science. And then a doctor shall preserve absolute secrecy on all he knows about his patient because of the confidence entrusted in him. And then if we go back to the page, we can see then the heading Human Experimentation, reference there to the Declaration of Helsinki. I'll come back to that when I look at documentation in relation to research. But what we can see is here, the BMA in its publication to doctors in 1970 is telling doctors about these international instruments. And then if we go to page 11, you'll see there's a section on professional confidence. I'll come back to that when I look at issues of confidentiality, but there's a more detailed set of advice to doctors on professional confidence in this document. What we then have, if we go over the page, sorry, if we go to page 13, my apologies, Shomik. We then start to see some of the more familiar items that we saw in some of the earlier guidance. So it then goes back to issues such as setting up in practice, advertising, interrelationship with other doctors, and so on. So the 1970 document starts to identify these ethical principles, but still doesn't flesh them out to the extent that we'll see in later materials. This publication, beginning in 1970, was updated on a fairly, not on an annual basis. I think it was next updated in 1974, then 1980, 81 and 82. By 1980, it's become something called the Handbook of Medical Ethics. And we may look at that at a later stage. Also, in the 1970s, so in 1972, the BMA published a document called Professional Standards, a statement prepared by the Board of Science and Education of the British Medical Association, and that is at, if you just give me a moment, BMAL 5082. So you'll see it's just entitled Professional Standards. If we go to the second page, we'll see the date, March 1972. And then if we go to page 4, we can see Statement of Panel on Professional Standards, Introduction. In April 1970, the Board of Science and Education invited a panel of younger doctors to identify areas of anxiety and conscience in medical practice. Trends in certain spheres of medical practice appeared to challenge the generally accepted principles that the function of the doctor is to maintain respect for human life and the health and welfare of his patients. The board considered it was an appropriate time for professional standards to be reviewed in the light of current knowledge and thought. And then we can see, if we look a little further down the page, we can see reference in paragraph 2 to some of the codes, so the Hippocratic Oath, the Nuremberg Code, I'll come on to that when we look at research, the Declaration of Geneva that we've looked at in passing already, and International Code of Medical Ethics, and the Declarations of Helsinki, and so on. And then if we go to the next page, we'll see in paragraph 4 at the top of the page, the understanding of and adherence to the principles of medical ethics are of the utmost importance to the profession. And then if we look at the next paragraph, we can see a heading, Teaching of Ethics. The teaching of medical ethics should be undertaken in the light of current knowledge and foreseeable advances. Ethics of medicine should form part of the medical curriculum. And at some point, so we'll seek to establish the points in time at which the teaching of medical ethics did become part of the medical curriculum. But you'll see that here being advised by the BMA. There aren't, I think, any other particular passages I'm proposing to refer you to in relation to this, but we can see there is a section on confidentiality, for example. But we can see, again, it's an attempt to identify and draw to doctors' attention some of the fundamental overarching principles of medical ethics and putting the health and welfare of patients as the priority. What we then get to, through the various different versions of the BMA guidance, some of which I'm going to come on to when we look at issues of consent, we then get to 1988 and its publication, Philosophy and Practice of Medical Ethics, and that's at BMAL 5080. And if we go to page, so if you give me page 5, in the preface, we'll see this. Originally, the words ethics and morals were Greek and Latin expressions for the same idea, the code of conduct acceptable and normal within a particular society. In the modern world, they've come to mean very different things. It's necessary to stress that this is a handbook of ethics, not of morals. The authors believe medical ethics to represent an accepted code of behaviour within a particular group, for our purposes, the medical profession. And then if we go to the 4th paragraph, it says, the approach to the subject is completely different from that in all previous editions. We've sought to set out the arguments and counter-arguments which lead either to universally accepted ethical principles of practice or consensus views. There are some situations in which there is no professional or public consensus and which by their very nature do not permit a consensus view. This edition of the Handbook of Medical Ethics represents our first major redraft since the 1980 edition was published. And so you'll see from this book published in 1980, or this guide published in 1980, was intended to take a different course from the materials that the BMA had produced previously, and to set out for the first time in more detail underlying principles, arguments and counter-arguments. And we can see that, again, I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but if we go to page 9, we can see under the heading Background, there's a chapter on the philosophical and religious influences on the development of medical ethics. And in the first paragraph, doctors use technical skills and expertise which the untrained person does not possess. Possessing these skills gives him great power over his patients, who by the very fact of being patients are dependent, ill and vulnerable. In caring for his patients, a doctor makes a series of judgments and decisions which patients have the right to expect are made fairly in the light of the doctor's knowledge and experience. Most people will agree with these statements. And then if we look at the next paragraph, the argument is about what influences the individual doctor in making judgments and decisions. Professor Ian Kennedy has asserted that the judgments are based not on the doctor's technical skill and training, but rather that doctors make decisions as to what ought to be done. And then it goes on to, again, quote from Professor Kennedy about ethics and his own view that medical ethics are not separate from but part of the general moral and ethical order by which we live. And that's a quotation from Professor Kennedy's Reith lectures, which were referred to in our expert group's report. And so we have this chapter on philosophical and religious influences on the development of medical ethics. If we go to page 13 of this document, so still within the chapter, halfway down the page, we can see this. It's universally agreed that a doctor should at least do no harm. This concept is enshrined in the Hippocratic Oath. And then we then see in the last sentence of that paragraph the issue of paternalism being raised, the assumption that the doctor knows better than anyone, including the patient, what's best for that patient. Paternalism is in direct conflict with the principle of autonomy. So again, we see the underlying principles and issues such as paternalism, issues such as autonomy, being here articulated in some detail by the BMA, in contrast to a number of the earlier publications. Broadly speaking, autonomy means that individuals should have personal liberty to decide their own actions or their own destiny. Although the concept of autonomy is not new, it is now becoming a central influence on the expectations of patients. In the past, many patients would accept without question decisions made by their doctor. Today, patients are more critical. And then bottom of that page, truth-telling, another principle by which people address medical ethics. The doctor and the patient are bound by an unspoken, unwritten agreement which is based on the patient's ability to trust his doctor. Truthfulness is therefore seen as important because it's a moral imperative in itself and on utilitarian grounds produces a good social relationship. So that we then, if we go to page 15, we can see there's then a chapter on discussing further concepts of autonomy and paternalism. I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but it's perhaps important to read in full. If we move on to within this chapter to page 19, we can see towards the bottom of the page the heading, the importance of communication. Good communication between doctor and patient is the foundation of a good relationship, which will ensure optimal use of the doctor's professional knowledge and skills and also the patient's understanding and cooperation. And it talks about how vital it is to explain information to patients. And then if we move to page 26, and I'll come back to this when I look at confidentiality in more detail, but we'll see there's a whole chapter in this guidance on confidentiality. And then if we go to page 35, we'll see their consent to treatment. So there's a whole chapter on consent to treatment. The basis of any discussion about consent is that a patient gives consent before any investigation and treatment proposed by the doctor. Doctors offer advice, but the patient decides whether to accept it. Before a patient consent, the options have to be presented in such a fashion as to allow a decision to be made. Consent must involve the ability to choose. One of the patient's options is not to be troubled with having to make a choice. Doctors sometimes argue that patients do not want to be told all the facts. In an increasingly articulate society, doctors are moving away from this paternalistic approach, and any doctor who decides to withhold information should examine stringently the reasons for doing so. Society is moving away from paternalism towards partnership. And then just picking it up, last few lines of that paragraph, even though a few patients don't want to be told, there is now little justification for withholding information, unless to tell all would be clearly detrimental to the individual. It is therefore only when the patient specifically delegates responsibility for the decision to the doctor that it's ethically right for the doctor not to disclose all of the relevant facts. And again, I'll come back to this part of the guidance in a little while.
Quite interesting that it talks about societies moving away from paternalism towards partnership. And what's interesting about it is that in the earlier, the 1970 edition, which you showed us, one of the first principles was mutual respect, which is difficult to have mutual respect if one person is telling the other what to do.
Yes. Indeed.
Mutual respect isn't spelled out in terms, but in one sense it could be regarded as a summary of everything that's said here.
Yes, absolutely. And indeed that's why when we were looking at the GMC's guidance produced in 1995, I made the observation that the guidance might be new, the guidance might change, but that doesn't mean the principles which underpin it are new. And so you're absolutely right. What we see increasingly in the guidance as it changes over the years is a much more detailed exposition, and here we see an actual discussion of some of the underlying philosophical and other arguments. But whether there's actually been a change in the core underlying ideas and principles, will be a matter for you to determine, sir.
Well, I think the view of our ethical experts would be that there hasn't been. And certainly if I'm right in the observations I've just made about mutual respect, what has changed is not the principle, but the articulation of it, or the degree of articulation of it.
Yes. The same year as the publication we've just been looking at, and as I say, I may come back to it a little bit more in this particular chapter, but in that same year, 1988, the BMA also published a document called Rights and Responsibilities of Doctors, and if we go to RLIT 40397, we can see that they're set out. And if we look, on the left-hand side, what we've got actually is the back page of the book there. Pick it up we pick it up at the top. Doctors have rights and responsibilities and duties and powers which require them to do or not to do certain things in certain circumstances. And then there's reference to codes, to legislation, and then Rights and Responsibilities provides a practical guide to the law as it affects doctors. It aims to cover the main areas that are of interest and concern to most doctors, designed as a handbook, etc., etc. So this was designed essentially as a handbook to be used by doctors, and I'm not going to go to the detailed content of it. And this is the 1992 version, I think, in any event. But if we go to page 4, we can just see from the table of contents that the very first chapter is about consent. And then if we go to the following page, we'll see that chapter 3 is about confidentiality, and indeed chapter 4, medical records. I don't think we've got that, necessarily have that chapter in what I have here, but I can certainly look and see if there's any answer there, sir, to the questions which you identified. And there's also a chapter on research. If we go to page, there is a chapter on research here. I can't find the reference to it at the moment. But in any event, those are the two twin publications that emanate from the BMA in 1988. So just before I then turn to a handful of the other organisations that have produced materials of relevance, I should perhaps have gone to the 1980 BMA Handbook, BMAL 5087. So I showed you, sir, previously the 1970 Guidance Medical Ethics, and then we saw a few minutes ago, the 1988 publication, Philosophy and Practice of Medical Ethics. As I say, various iterations over the years. But the 1981 was perhaps contained some more substantive articulation of principles than the 1970 or 1974 versions. And so I'll just draw attention to some of the contents of the 1980 guidance. So if we go to page 4, first of all, we'll see there the date at the top of the page. So this is the 1980 publication. If we go to the next page, we can see there set out under the heading Forward. In this handbook, we set out the broad framework of ethics within which the medical profession works. If we go to page 7, we can see, just picking it up in the first paragraph, because of their special knowledge and the vulnerability of their patients, members of the medical profession have traditionally been regarded as particularly trustworthy and responsible by the public. From the profession, therefore, society expects high standards, not only of scientific education and clinical skill, but also of professional and humane conduct. And then if we go to page 9, we'll see under the heading Therapeutic Doctor-Patient Relationships, so paragraph 1.2 talks about how the first form of contact may be a person consulting a doctor as a patient, and then the doctor then acts in the interests of the patient and is responsible to the patient for his actions. So again, an articulation there of some fairly basic principles. There is then, over the page, and I'll come back to this after the break when I look at consent in more detail, but you'll see there's a section on consent. If we go then to page 15, there's then a more general section on trust. And if we pick it up in paragraph 2.6, the relationship between patient and doctor is based on trust. And then there's a section on research. Again, I'll come back to that. If we go to page 66, in fact, I'll pick it up, sorry, Seamus, page 53. So there's a section of this 1980 book which then looks at a range of different ethical codes. From the Hippocratic Oath, we go over the page to material produced by the World Medical Association. Again, I'll come back to some of these as necessary. We go over the page, go over 2 pages to page 56. We see reference to motions on discrimination in medicine. Then we see reference at the bottom of the page to the Declaration of Helsinki. And that's set out, so the text is set out of the Declaration of Helsinki. There are a number of other international documents, conventions, guidelines set out. And then if we go then to page 66, you'll see that the BMA also then set out and drew to the attention of doctors various national codes. So we've got the code of the ethical code of the Commonwealth Medical Association. Doctor's primary loyalty is to his patient, is paragraph 1 of that. Paragraph 3, he shall respect human life and studiously avoid doing it injury. Paragraph 5, he shall respect the confidence of his patient as he would his own. And then we can see, if we go back to that page, the Canadian Medical Association Code of Conduct. There's a code of ethics there. 1, consider first the well-being of the patient. 2, honour your profession and its traditions. And then if we go to the next page, and this is all part still of the Canadian Code, bottom of the page, responsibilities to the patient. We see there the concept of the ethical physician, and at the bottom of that page, the concept of patient's rights. In particular, point 5 will recognise, so this is what the ethical physician will do, he will recognise that the patient has the right to accept or reject any physician and any medical care recommended to him. And then if we go over the page again, still in this section of what the ethical physician under the Canadian Code will do. Paragraph 8, for example, will recommend only those diagnostic procedures which he believes necessary to assist him in the care of the patient, and therapy which he believes necessary for the well-being of the patient. And then you'll see, if we go to the next page, there's a section on clinical research. And then if we go to page 72, you'll see there a heading, Ethical Decisions of Annual Representative Meetings. These are forms of decision-making by the BMA's representative body. And you'll see on the next page, one of those decisions taken by the BMA was about confidentiality of medical records. So again, I'm not going to go through the detail of that, but what you'll see from the structure of this is that, as well as the specific sections of the Handbook of Medical Ethics which look at issues such as consent and confidentiality, the doctor's decision is, the doctor's attention is here being drawn to these various multiple international and national codes and ethical standards. So I note the time might be a sensible point at which to take a break, because I'm going to move on from the BMA just to look at a handful of other organisations before I then look at the specific guidance on consent.
Well, let's then have a break until 11:45. 11:45.